So it probably is my opportunity to, and great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for the third in our series on active environmentalism, and to welcome to our club, our audience this evening, Isabella Tree and Philip Marsden, who both in their own ways have led an active environmentalist life already. And of course, we're here to explore a topic which we touched on last week with Ben Goldsmith, and to take further, I sense, with Isabella from some really empirical experience that she's had in 20 years of setting up a remarkable location in Neb in West Sussex, which I'm sure you don't know, you soon will do. And it's a remarkable story and a remarkable publication that accompanies it. And it's a really amazing story that binds in also with Philip's own interest in wood in many ways, not just in wooden boats, which he's very well known as an author of a travelogue around the Outer Hebrides and the British Isles, but also in terms of reforestation here in the country. And these questions of carbon sequestration, of what we can do on an individual basis, firstly by understanding what's going on, and also taking an active part off the back of it, are the bedrock of these conversations. And so really, in this, I thought I would be in much better position to ask Philip to guide us through in conversation with Isabella about some of the topics that really started you off, if I may, Isabella, and take you on from there. And perhaps if you as an audience have got thoughts you'd like to share with us, please do. It's your evening as well to be part of the conversation. So drop your thoughts to us through the chat, and we'll do our best to stitch them into the conversation and bring them in around to 25 minutes, half an hour's time or so, depending on how we all sort of play along. So thank you very much. Philip, you're in Cornwall overlooking the Fowl. Thank you for bringing us together and taking us on from here on the amazing topic, and amazing person that is Isabella Tree.
Thank you, Johnny, and welcome to everyone. Yes, I'll just start by welcoming and introducing Isabella. She and I go back, we both cut our teeth as travel writers in the 80s and 90s, 90s more in her case. And she wrote some wonderful books out Mexico, New Guinea, and Nepal. But probably her more well-known role now is as leader of NEP and this extraordinary project that she's been doing. I imagine most of you are familiar with the book Wilding. It's an astonishing book. It's beautifully done. I was rereading it recently, and I remembered a lot of the story, a lot of the facts, a lot of the arguments she puts, and I'd forgotten what a great storyteller she is. And I think that a lot of the success of the book is not only that it strikes this extraordinary moment in our sort of ecological history, but it's also a story, and it's a story of her involvement with a particular place and what can be done. If none of you are familiar with it, I urge you to go out and buy a copy as soon as this is over. You won't regret it. And I thought I'd just kick off really to ask Isabella to give a brief resume of the project, and perhaps to sort of update it. The book was published in 2018, and just to see, because it is an ongoing project, to see how it's sort of been moving on from there and what her sort of brief thoughts are about that. So Isabella.
Well, I mean, that's an incredibly generous introduction. Thank you very much, Philip. Yeah, I mean, NEP, it's a 3,500 acre estate in Sussex. So it was a large farm by sort of conventional standards, I suppose, for lowland Britain. When my husband, Charlie Burrell, he inherited it from his grandparents in the 1980s. And it was already a failing farm. It was intensive arable and dairy, and already losing money hand over fist. We're on very, very heavy clay here. When I was researching the book, I discovered that there were 35 different words for mud. I mean, that's how much Sussex clay governs our lives. And it just means that, you know, economically, you just can't make farming work on this land. You know, for 6 months of the year, in a wet winter like we're having now, you just can't get farm machinery onto the land. So you can't sow spring crops, you can't do any maintenance, dig out ditches. You just can't be competitive with lovely loamy soils, grade 1, grade 2 soils over in Chichester. So it took us 17 years to realize that. But finally, it was really Charlie, I think, my husband, who had the courage, the kind of imagination, I guess, to draw a line underneath farming, because it wasn't a very popular decision at the time, certainly not with the family or with many of our neighbors, because they really couldn't understand what we were doing. But we could absolutely see no future in farming on this marginal land. We felt that the subsidy system was long overdue for a rehaul, so we couldn't be reliant on subsidies for much longer. That's what was keeping us afloat. Amazingly, it's taken until now with Brexit for that to be addressed, and Europe still hasn't got their heads around it. But we finally realized in 2000 that we had to do something radically different with this land. And we were really inspired by a Dutch ecologist called Frans Vera, whose work really has been changing the whole face of ecology in Europe. His book, Grazing Ecology and Forest History, was published in 2000, which was the year that we sold our farm machinery and our very sadly, our herds of dairy cows, and cleared the balance sheet. So we were in a very much a kind of open mind space to kind of welcome his ideas on board. And what Frans is saying in his book, Grazing Ecology and Forest History, is that in all our imaginings of what temperate zone Europe used to look like, we've completely forgotten about all the free roaming animals that would have been here. So the bison, the tarpan, the original horse, the aurochs, the original cow, wild boar, bison, red deer, elk, reindeer, beavers by the millions. We've forgotten about all these populations of animals that would have made our landscape look much more like the Serengeti. It would have been much more open wood pasture. I suppose we've still got scraps of it left, like the New Forest. It would have been much more open grown trees, groves of trees, heathland, scrub, very dynamic, always moved on by these free roaming animals. And so when we decided to do a kind of nature conservation project here at NEP, we thought, well, rather than do hands-on conservation, which we know is failing, our biodiversity species in Britain are still tumbling off a cliff. All our conservation efforts are failing to address what's happening. We could do something radically different and release free roaming animals into this area and let them create the habitat, let them sort of drive the system for us. So really keeping our hands off managing as much as possible, having no targets, no goals, and just seeing what happened and allowing thorny scrub to come back, allowing whatever trees would come back, and then introducing these herbivores to be proxies in a way for what would have been here in the past. And what's happened has been completely astonishing, way beyond anything we could have imagined, and way beyond anything that ecologists observing and being on our advisory board ever thought could happen. We've now got some of the rarest species in Britain, including nightingales, turtle doves, purple emperor butterflies, peregrine falcons, all breeding here. We've become this biodiversity hotspot from 20 years ago being a depleted, absolutely useless biologically speaking piece of land. We've now gone to being one of the most important areas for nature in Britain. I mean, it's astonishing, and we're underneath the Gatwick stacking system. I mean, if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. So I think it's really blown all the expectations of how quickly and how readily nature will bounce back if you put the right drivers in place. And so what we've seen really in the last few years, the last 2 or 3 years, and certainly since the book has been published, which is incredibly exciting. And I think it's also, it's obviously not just us or the book, but I think it's the temperature of the times. It's this sort of moment where, we've got the sort of Greta Thunberg effect. We've got Extinction Rebellion. We've got David Attenborough and the plastics revolution. Suddenly, there's this real groundswell of feeling, I think, publicly, that things have to change, and a willingness of people to think more imaginatively about what the landscape could be. So suddenly NEP has become a model, just because I suppose we got here first and we've got results to show for it, for other people in Britain, both small and large scale. So already hundreds of thousands of hectares of rewilding projects have started in North Norfolk, Northumberland, Cornwall, you name it, around the countryside. And we have rewilding workshops that are regularly booked out, with people going away and doing their bit, which is just incredibly exciting.
I mean, I think it has struck a real chord in a moment, when, as you say, some sort of tide is turning. And I think I want to focus in on because rewilding is, in some corners it's a toxic word. I mean, there are many people who just like any enthusiasm, any sort of almost like a sort of cult, people come in with this enthusiasm, and other people kind of react against it as if it was heretical. So there is a sort of, it's become a sort of baggy term, I think, and I wanted to just explore some of the sort of detail of it, and to come on a bit later to the herbivores, but I want to start with trees. And it seems that a lot of sort of government strategy and a lot of local strategy and global strategy is about this, addresses both the climate crisis and the sort of biodiversity crisis and the restoration of habitats. And I just wanted your thoughts on how you think that strategy is working on a global scale, on a national scale, on a local scale, and what it does offer, and some of the problems that have been faced by it.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of planting trees has, ignited really, and part of the fuel behind the ignition, I think, is this idea that it's a quick fix for sequestering carbon. And I think that is very misguided, and it's a very complicated issue. And we don't know enough about it yet, to be sure. Certainly reports and studies that have been done in the tropics show that natural regeneration, natural forest, is 40 times better at sequestering carbon than plantations. So when people look at planting trees for carbon sequestration, often they look just simply at the tree itself and the carbon sequestered in the tree, without looking at the soil around it, the environment around it, all the vegetation that could be around it. And also not looking at either the carbon costs of planting those trees. So that's enormous. If you think about the commercial nurseries where these trees are propagated, that's a huge carbon expense in these massive nurseries, most of which are in Holland. So if you're planting trees in the UK, they're imported from Holland usually. And that's transport costs. And then you're planting a sapling which has been grown under artificial conditions inside a polypropylene tube attached to a tunnelized wooden stake with a plastic tie. You've got the cost of the volunteers, or if you're paying people to actually go out and plant them. And then you might be planting the wrong trees. So half of the trees that have already been planted as part of the government strategy to meet its 2050 carbon targets are commercial plantations of Sitka spruce and that kind of thing. So non-natives, all single species, single generational, and often in uplands and highlands, which are peat. So if you plant on peat, you're releasing carbon into the atmosphere, and you're also reducing the albedo effect, this kind of reflection effect that happens because dense deciduous fir trees can actually absorb more heat from the sun. So you're actually warming the atmosphere. So planting trees isn't necessarily, or in any way, the quick fix that we think it is. Kew Gardens has just been a lead of a publication that's just come out, I think it was announced this week, where they've published 10 golden rules for reforestation. And the first rule is protect the forests you've got. So, at the same time as we've got these millions and millions and millions of trees being planted all over the world, we're still deforesting natural functioning forest, which is completely mad. There's the other golden rule that they have is natural regeneration wherever possible. And Rewilding Britain, again, has written a report saying that natural regeneration should be the default mechanism for re-establishing trees. The problem is we are in a planting mindset. We've forgotten how trees naturally regenerate without us. And what's exciting, I think, about NEP is it shows how easily trees come back if you let them. And the natural habitat for trees is thorny scrub. So here it's blackthorn, hawthorn, dog rose, bramble, gorse. It's all those shrubs that we have zero tolerance for in our cultural mindset. We've grown up thinking that scrubland is useless and valueless. We call it wasteland, and we send in the diggers and the chainsaws and get rid of it as quickly as possible. But in the past, in medieval times, it was a really valued commodity. And perhaps now, actually, now that with the plastics revolution, we'll find uses again for all these amazing woods. And we'll start needing thorny scrub again for all the things that we'll want to make instead of plastic. So thorny scrub is how saplings they'll regenerate within those thorny it's nature's barbed wire, essentially. It's the fencing that keeps the livestock, the rabbits and the deer and everything else out from eating them. So a jay will come in. A jay can plant 6,000 acorns in 3 weeks, one single jay. And it will plant an acorn near a vertical and upright, so it can remember where it is, usually of thorny scrub. And that thorny scrub, as it grows, will protect the oak. So at NEP, we have hundreds and hundreds, thousands of oaks that have naturally regenerated on our post-arable fields without any fencing, with no cost at all. So it is completely doable, and this is the problem is we have to change our mindset of spades in the ground, and the funding models that fund people, including grant aid, to put X amount of trees in. Because with natural regeneration, of course, you can't predict how many oaks or crab apples or wild service or birch or hornbeam you're going to get. It's just nature does it for you. So we've got to change the funding model, and we've got to, I think, rehabilitate thorny scrub as a nursery for natural regeneration.
So a few years ago, we got a small bit of land here, and we got a Forestry Commission grant for woodland creation, and it came with all sorts of rules and a certain density per acre, deer protection. We managed to get a concession where half the land was for natural regeneration, and we just left that, and it shows almost the same density as the planting, which is extraordinary. In pasture, oaks, home oaks have come up, and then the blackthorn comes in, and the deer stop their nibbling, and the rabbits stop their nibbling. So we certainly have learned that lesson of the value of natural regeneration.
Yeah, I think one point I think that's never discussed when people talk about planting trees, of course, is the sort of biodiversity value of the vegetation succession as it grows up. So all the other species around the trees themselves that should need light and need to be able to express themselves to benefit biodiversity. But one really, really crucial question in all of this is biosecurity. It's the genetic diversity of our trees. If you think of the immense variation you can get in wild trees because of the distance that pollen can travel, the distance that seeds can travel, An oak, for example, when you look at an oak tree, every single acorn on that oak tree, the thousands of acorns on it, are genetically different from each other. They're all unique. And that is what we're discovering about ash, the ash dieback. You know, we thought we were going to lose ash completely, but we now know that in every wild ash population, there are individuals of ash that are resistant to the Corolla disease. And that is because they are so genetically diverse that not only can they can specialize in adapting to their own locality, their own weather, their own typical climate in that region, they can also adapt to long-term climate change and also quick impacts like disease. And they can do both incredibly effectively. Nothing humans can do in terms of propagation can ever replicate that infinite amount of genetic diversity. So if we don't have naturally regenerated wild trees in our landscape, we're going to jeopardize the future of all trees in Britain, because we're only going to get more diseases as our climate warms, with these enormous pollen plumes that come over all the time from Europe. And with transport, even if we stop importing plants into commercial nurseries, seeds will still get here, the diseases will still get here, the funguses will still get here with our international travel. So we just have to maximize the amount of wild trees we have in the landscape. And the only way to do that is natural regeneration.
Oliver Rackham, that great the sort of grandfather of arborealism in this country, said that if you want to create woodland, the worst thing you can do is plant trees.
Yeah.
And this was in the 70s and 80s, and actually he warned about the problem then of large scale tree plantations, which have to import trees, and with them come the disease. And it sort of makes me think that part of the problem about the sort of tree strategies is that they're top down. And I know here locally in Cornwall there are lots of local schemes where people identify pockets of land and encouraged to collect seed locally. And it's something that one can do on particular pockets of land that people know, and then to look after it. I mean, it's a real example, I think, the problems of tree planting, of top-down policy. And when you have local groups and the enthusiasm of local people to plant trees, collect seed, or just to leave a bit of ground,
yeah,
just to look after it, see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you always have to question, you know, if it costs money, you know, why are we doing it really? You know, there's huge vested interests, you know, the sort of commercial forestry interests, the commercial nurseries, the garden, your local garden centre. I mean, there's the massive commercial interests in this tree planting, you know, sort of bandwagon. But I think we do, as you say, I think we have to get more imaginative about how, because it's lovely planting, you know, it is lovely planting a tree and seeing it grow. And especially if it's with your children, it's a very good way of communicating and getting people connected with trees and nature. But there are other ways of doing it. And as you say, collecting local seed sources, scattering them into the straggling bushes, as they used to do in medieval times. You know, my mother always used to carry, you know, pick up a pocket of acorns, and whenever we went for a walk, she would throw acorns into the hedges. So, you know, I think there's different ways of doing it, and preparing ground, just, you know, preparing ground for the seed rain to come in, you know, is another way.
And as you say, thorny scrub. One of the things that I think the sort of mindsets we've got to re-examine is about what woods are. I mean, we think of woods as sort of dark places you go and closed canopy and you sort of explore in that way, and then you come out into an open field, and that's the landscape. You've got fields and you've got woods. But the whole notion of well, you mentioned it, of places like the New Forest and places that have been left, it's not closed canopy. And the idea of the oak not being a naturally closed canopy tree, and thinking of a landscape, a rewilded landscape, as being scrubland and isolated trees, and that I think is a mindset. It's, as you say, the wood, the notion of the wood being a dark place.
Yes.
Re-examined.
I think that's absolutely true. And, you know, we go back to the original word for forest. It was, you know, like the New Forest, it was a very complex mosaic of habitats. And, you know, closed canopy woodland, which is what will happen if you just plant trees close together, is very, very species poor. I think there's 3 birds, if that, that feed and breed in closed canopy woodland alone. All our other species, including our flora, need to have light conditions. They need semi-light or full sunlight to thrive. And I think this is so interesting too, you know, how our mindset has changed. And, you know, just thinking of, you know, talking under the wonderful Messam's umbrella. But, you know, if we go back and look at old master paintings, you know, the vision of Arcadia, of the sort of the wild, untrammeled forest, you know, is very much the open grown trees. You have dead trees in the landscape. Again, something that we just don't tolerate anymore. We chainsaw them down as soon as they die. But, you know, to the aesthetic of 200 or 300 years ago was very much a dead tree in the landscape is the beginnings of new life. It's continuity. There was huge respect for it. Even Humphrey Repton, for goodness sake, Wrecker Repton, you know, felt that dead trees in a landscape gave it a sort of sense of gravitas, you know, of the cycle of life. And so I think it's very interesting going back on, you know, our visuals and how we can change our aesthetic, how our aesthetics have changed. And I think the Victorians have a lot to answer for. The Victorian sort of obsession with tidying up, which of course came with industrialization and mechanized tools to be able to tidy up with. But why do we cut down dead trees? And here we have, you know, this disaster with our ash. At least it's a short-term disaster because we know they will survive eventually. But you know, where they are not a threat to buildings or property and people, so when they're not close to footpaths, we should be leaving our ash because they hollow out very, very quickly. The ash that we've left here at Net, obviously we have to cut down everything that's anywhere near a footpath, but already is hollowing out, and we've seen wild bees colonizing inside the ash. So, you know, when we think about our landscape and how we have leveled every dead tree over 200 years or so, we've deprived an enormous amount of wildlife that specialize in those big hollow trees of a habitat. And that's one reason why wild bees are in such a precarious situation now, and why we find them nesting in our loft spaces, because they can't find big enough cavities in the landscape.
That's really interesting. Philip, I wonder if I might just take us on that little journey down the road of aesthetics and think about it, because you're absolutely right. We're sort of trained. If I was going to show you and sell you a beautiful painting, it probably has got an idyllic landscape in with a nice sort of pastoral background, couple of trees on a clump, nothing too hectic, and everything well clipped and mannered. And you probably think that's a fantastic representation of English pastoral idyll. So interesting, that sort of default. And part of, I suppose, this conversation, I think, is to make us think about what beauty really can be. It's only it's a different aesthetic, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think, you know, I mean, for me, I mean, just from the beginning of this rewilding journey, you know, my aesthetic has changed completely. You know, I grew up in Dorset, near Shaftesbury, and, you know, walked the South Downs, and, you know, those barren hills were very much what I thought was beautiful. And I stood on the top of Wyn Green and looked out at, you know, these neat parcels of fields. And I thought, how stunning is that? You know, that's how our landscape is meant to be. Now I look at it and it's a biological desert. And so it's not beautiful to me anymore. And so I think it's really, you know, once you know that a landscape isn't functioning, once you know the damage it's doing to biodiversity and to us, you know, you can't think of it in that nostalgic way anymore. It is difficult to sever your childhood feelings, perhaps, or your childhood attachments to a place, but I think it's important to do that and to be very level-headed about, you know, where do we get our aesthetic from? You know,
we're fickle
what tells
beasts,
us
though,
what's
aren't we?
beauty?
I think one of the big plus points of rewilding is that it doesn't require much work. I mean, it's like a teenager's bedroom. You can just leave it, and it's
Yeah.
it's virtuous. It's good.
On that email, I would have seen
And I think the mess, you know, the idea of mess, as you said, I think, you know, being used to mess and how deeply ingrained the idea of controlling the environment and controlling it by dominating it with machinery, tidying it up. And we now know that's extremely unhealthy, extremely damaging. And actually, I find it quite quickly. When I first came here, I cleared. There were brambles in the house actually, and growing inside.
Maybe a step too far.
That is taking rewilding a bit too far. A pheasant laid an egg inside on the first week we were here, but I in 10 years or so, I have sort of adjusted my notion of things to appreciate mess, and to having learned from your book and others about how valuable and how biodiverse is messy. It's not tidy.
Philip,
I think it's very difficult for people. I mean, it's still difficult, I think, you know, for us to do. I mean, we had this extraordinary moment when the park around the house is still we have quite a lot of browsers and grazers in it, so it still looks like a kind of conventional parkland. And one year we just had the acres and acres and acres of it. I mean, you know, 20, 30, 40 acres covered in creeping thistle. And this was about 6 or 7 years into the project, and we were quite cool about it for the first year, but they didn't go and they didn't go. And we'd made this kind of commitment to not intervening. And we were, you know, by about year 3, Charlie was thinking, my God, we are going to have to get out with the herbicides and the toppers and do something about this. And luckily we didn't, because suddenly it coincided with this amazing boom year, a migration of painted lady butterflies that came over from Morocco, millions of them, and tens of thousands of them landed on our creeping thistle, which is a food plant for the painted lady. They lay their eggs, the caterpillars hatched out, munched through the creeping thistle, leaving these kind of straggly, pathetic stalks behind them. And the next year, every single creeping thistle plant had gone. And so I think it's a lot about holding your nerve and trusting in the kind of boom and bust cycles of nature. So even in your garden, you know, if you're getting, you know, a sort of outbreak of caterpillars eating your cabbages and your brassicas, you know, rather than getting out the pest control that year, you know, what about thinking, well, let's sacrifice the brassicas for a couple of years, just keep planting and wait, and a predator will come in, sure as anything, to clean up those caterpillars. Any amount of abundance in nature is always going to attract something to eat it. Dave Goulson's written a brilliant book, The Jungle Garden, about how to get these natural processes happening in your garden. And we're just doing that here now in the Victorian Wall Garden. And it is challenging, you know, because it's so ingrained in us to control. And we think we're doing a good thing. We like to be active and think, got to get the leaf blower out, you know, and so much better just to relax a bit.
I just want to pick you up on one example of, you say a predator always comes in, and just mention the D word, which is deer. Doubled in population, I think, to an estimated 2 million since 1999. And I think a lot during lockdown, a lot of people have noticed that the deer have got even more numerous. Yeah. And the reason being that they don't have a predator until we introduce lynx or whatever. And I know from my own trees, and they the expense and the time, and also the distortion of the trees, is from the deer guards to protect.
Yeah. And I mean, it is a real problem. We've got more deer in this country now than we've had for 5,000 years. And you know, there isn't the apex predator, of course, but actually apex predators, don't actually control populations. They, if you think of somewhere like the Serengeti, the predators will be responsible for probably about 10% of the mortalities of the herbivores. What they do, of course, is they put other pressures on them. They put more stress on them, and they move them on, and they bunch them up. They make it more difficult for them to breed. But ultimately, what is going to regulate the populations of herbivores are the food resources. So in a country that is as micromanaged and as cut up and fragmented as Britain, there's very little nature left. But you've got these artificially high, in a sense, populations of deer because they're feeding, it outside natural areas in a way. So, we have to control them. And we have this very bizarre situation where we keep deer numbers artificially high in Scotland for stalking, and yet we don't kill deer here. This wonderful, healthy, naturally grown meat on our doorstep. If we were in Europe, we obviously, we would. There's much more of a culture of hunting for the pot, and we've just lost that knack. But again, we have a large population of fallow and red deer here, and we already had a population of roe deer at the very beginning of the project. And again, it's the thorny scrub that protects these trees. So we're still getting recruitment of trees and oaks, oaks in particular, because this is big oak country, in the presence of free roaming herbivores. So it's thorny scrub that we've forgotten about. That is the key.
Love the thorny scrub. There we are. That's brilliant. Philip, I wonder if you might have spotted, but I'll pick up, if I may, and just throw a few questions to both of you, if that's okay, just because there are so many streaming in, quite rightly, people keen to get involved and hear the topic. And you couldn't have hit a better question right there, actually. Food source. Are we able to kind of eat better off this sort of landscape? Someone here said, well, yeah, we're the apex. We should be eating more venison.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Philip would agree. I think absolutely we should be eating more venison. I think, obviously, and Ben talked brilliantly about this last week, we're always going to need food, land for producing food, and that has to change to regenerative agricultural practices. For all the reasons that Ben explained so beautifully last week. But I think rewilding can be the webbing that runs between the farmland. So even in our big arable belts, we should have rewilding corridors to connect areas of nature together. And because rewilding, just like regenerative agriculture, relies on livestock or wild animals to keep regenerating the soils, to provide all the opportunities for dung beetles and everything else for the entire food system, they are an integral part of the ecosystem. Then we can derive meat both from rewilding projects and from intensive agriculture.
I think that's really, really salient. And the question leads on very well to another question, which is, I mean, are you able to use it as a model for people to say, this is a financial platform that as a farmer you could convert to? So this is a question, obviously, from other people looking at it going, well, is there a sustainable model yet? There may well yet be, but as it stands at the moment.
Yes, I mean, this is why we moved into it. I mean, because farming was just financially unviable for us. So we moved into rewilding when we were £1.5 million in debt because of farming. And the only thing that was keeping us afloat was subsidies. And that is all changing now. And we're moving into the ELM, Environmental Land Management Scheme, which will pay farmers for not simply producing food like before, but also for providing ecosystem services and public goods. So it'll be paying farmers for restoring the soil, and not just farmers, but land managers. So it will pay you for restoring the soil, mitigating against floods, purifying your water, sequestering carbon, producing biodiversity, all these things that we desperately, desperately need. Purifying your air. We know how many people affected by pollution in our cities. If we could rewild our green belts, that would do a lot for that problem. So there's that, and we still get countryside stewardship, which will move into Elm, and I think this is really important. This incentive, the carrot, if you like, for thinking of different ways that you can manage your land. But rewilding for us has already, I think, put us very securely on the road to sustainability, even without subsidies. I mean, we hope we get them because we're greedy, and we'd like to do a lot more with it. But already we have an ecotourism business, glamping and camping and safaris, which does incredibly well. We make I think last year the turnover was 500 or 600,000, and that was in its 6th year. And we make a 20% margin on that. As a farmer, we were making -1 or +1% of a margin. So that's huge. You're also releasing, of course, all your agricultural buildings. Those were things that really cost an arm and a leg to keep the roof on, to just keep the infrastructure going that is part of the whole farming business. And now we're, admittedly with capital outlay, we are actually investing in these buildings to convert them into light industrial use, storage space, or offices. So that's now bringing in rent. And those buildings, although we don't directly employ the people in them because they're rented from us, are employing 200 people. So that's 200 people back in the rural environment. And then finally, you've got your meat. So we sell 75 tons of organic, free-roaming, pasture-fed meat, we can sell at a premium. So these big income streams that come in, and I think these also can be scaled down.
It's really interesting, isn't it, Philip? Because it's very much the line that we were taking last week with this idea of premium-led biodiversity in terms of animals on the land. And I think, very prescient approach of ELM, which we're hearing from in terms of Nick from Westerholz next weekend, actually, about how the UK government is going to effectively put money towards land sustainability, land management projects like this. It's quite useful. I wondered about that question on just sticking with the topic of access, because one of the people here has written just to ask, as they are in management, I think, of 60,000 acres across the UK, which is a considerable responsibility, and the balance between tourism, if you like, potential degradation versus access, and obviously also revenue. I guess interested to get your thoughts on what a practical balance from both of your perspective would be, because I know you both have woodland you manage. Philip.
Well, I mean,
well, yes, in our case, sorry, I mean, in our case, it's not really a problem. One of the incentives that I had to sort of generate woodland was that on the banks of the River Fowl, it's naturally oak wood anyway, which is used for tanning, and it's simply, I wanted to sort of replace the pasture because we had no animals with that to sort of to replicate it and to sort of create what was the sort of natural environment. Oliver Rackham was a great fan of the Fowl and the Helford as being very rare examples of where you get woodland right down to seawater, and you get some rare examples of that. So access we're very inaccessible. But the only way you can get up to it is by boat. But it was a help to have Rackham's example. One thing I wanted to say about our experience of rewilding, which comes out of Isabella's book as well, is how quick it is. How, in a sense, one's thinking of the natural world as being very slow, this huge, great sort of juggernaut of forces beyond our control. And therefore, if you do anything, it's going to have a sort of long, it's going to take a long time. What's extraordinary, I think, and anyone who's had this experience of leaving a quarter of the garden, is that within a few years, within a year you get a change, and then the next year it's a different change, and so the excitement and the sort of impatience, we are impatient as a species, and I think that's one of the great rewards of rewilding is that its rewards are quite immediate. I mean, there are long-term benefits as well, but anyone, I think, can see this sort of gradation over just a few years from something that's barren to something that becomes very diverse and fascinating because of that.
It's really good to hear you say that. And if I may, can we track onto that again? So I know that there'll be people who want to think about actually what they can do. And Isabella, I wondered if you wanted to come in on that thought about, I suppose, public access.
Yeah, I mean, I just wrote a piece for The Guardian, actually, in response to a letter, wanting, open access, free access to the right to roam, and essentially what I think, who wouldn't want our children to be able to wander anywhere and jump into rivers and climb trees and have that freedom and be the ambassadors for the future of nature. But at the moment, our nature is we have so little of it that it's under enormous pressure from people. And it is a balance that we need to strike, at least until we have been able to rewild, lots more areas and actually connect them with wildlife corridors to make them function. In the 3 months after lockdown, the first lockdown, we had 30,000 people walking on our footpaths. We've got 16 miles of footpaths, and 30,000 people is about 10 times more than we usually get. Yeah. And they were completely different demographic, mostly from London, actually. So not used to countryside, not used to understanding about footpaths. So that's been a huge learning curve for us. So we've got our signage a lot better. And we've also had to apologise to a lot of neighbours who've blamed us for the parking in their drives and things. But it's a madness when we have to get into a car to be able to go and walk somewhere. We have to have our green belts joined up with the areas of nature so you can actually walk out of your door wherever you are and within 5 minutes get into a proper functioning nature. To get into a car to have to walk is absurd. But I think there is a balance to be struck. So, for us, we keep our ecotourism business actually quite small. We have vehicles that we take people out in. So we have 2 Austrian Pinzgauers that we take people out in, troop carriers. But we, actually that's very little impact on wildlife itself, because, we go on a particular circuit. We avoid areas that we know are breeding grounds for nesting birds at certain times of year. We can control that, and it's actually very low impact. What is a little bit more worrying is when you have low-level dog walkers wandering off the footpaths all the time. So and most people don't want to wander off a footpath. I think most people actually like to obey the rules, and they want to help, and they want to do the right thing. And so, it's a question of signage and kind of direction and education, and having the right notices in place saying wildlife only and what's going on here and why you shouldn't approach a red deer stag in the rut, that kind of thing.
It's really interesting. It's a topic you can readily see around. So we've lost the immediate connection with nature, and it's a really interesting idea. Someone's just chipped in and said, what about the slow ways? Which in a way, it's so tantalizing listening to you talk, both of you, in different ways. Because Isabella, you're so kind of languid about the sort of letting things come to you. And there's an energy that I think we all have to make change, to do things. We have to go out and feel like we're kind of activating things. And perhaps there are things we can do. I don't know. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. And it came to my mind when you were talking about the lunacy of getting in a car to go and be in the landscape, that perhaps if we were looking at what was effectively under our nose, or at least on our driveway or on our doorstep, what we can do to perhaps activate those areas, and other than keep the clippers at bay.
Well, that's a big thing. And of course, going organic, not using any chemicals. So as soon as you stop using chemicals, I'm beginning to feel that actually, if we go to a garden centre to buy something, that's almost a failure. Why are you doing it? You know, even if you're buying a bird nesting box, you know, why are you doing that? There should be habitat in your garden, you know, a lovely thorny bush or, you know, some thick scrub. Birds are much better at nesting in a natural situation than they are in a bird box. So I think, you know, I've got a friend who has rewilded the back of his back garden in Bristol. He's a wildlife cameraman and brilliant at his ecology. So I think he counted 35 grass snakes in his back garden because of the habitat he's created. But more importantly, what he's done is he's talked to his neighbours in that street. And so one neighbour will have a sandbank, another will have a beetle bank, another's got a small pond. So they've all got different habitats in their garden. And then between them, they have cut holes in their fences so that hedgehogs can move through. So now that whole back street has become a wildlife corridor. And if you've got a park at one end and a railway embankment at the other, then that becomes a hugely significant corridor. So you're suddenly getting, you know, really interesting species back into your urban parks.
Yeah.
You know, we need to be thinking, we were talking to the guy who manages 10,000 kilometers of railway embankments. Charlie, he said, what advice, you know, could we give him for managing those embankments for biodiversity? And Charlie came up with this brilliant idea and said, just think like a beaver. So instead of waiting till the trees have grown really tall and they're a danger to the track and you've got to fell them to the bottom, just keep coppicing all the way along in rotation. And that's what a beaver will do. And that is incredible for biodiversity. It'll hold the embankment together, stop it eroding and the soil falling onto the tracks, but without the danger of a big tree toppling. So suddenly you've got these railways that can become really, really important wildlife corridors.
Yeah, that's really is interesting, isn't it? And that's a brilliant activity as well in its own right. Huge fan of coppicing. And to track us into, I suppose it combines the thought of the shifting aesthetics in the sense that you might, I mean, it's a problem that's outside of our control, but it's one that you are in a position to activate and we are in a position to consider is the urban environment. And so if by happenstance we were looking at landscapes, cityscapes differently, and there was an architect in the house tonight who might be thinking about building differently, what advice would you be giving to them about putting together close block community buildings in this day and age?
Well, I don't know. I am hopefully going to be researching a chapter on urban rewilding, but I don't know much about architecture yet. But I mean, I know there's amazing things with green roofs and green walls and all that sort of thing. What I think is, as I say, is the most important thing is the connectivity. So using, canals and any paths that go in, if you can link up parks together and leave rougher areas in parks as well as in your, back gardens and connecting back gardens. That is where, you have this exponential effect. What happens when you just think in a very isolated way is that you may have a population of something that's quite interesting, but then it's an island, and what populations on islands, what happened to them, the genetic diversity collapses, and soon the population is unviable. So species that don't have a permeability index, that can't actually move very easily, like hedgehogs, become very unviable. So it's also about pollution. It's lack of pollution. So our waterways should be fantastic arteries for life, and we are still the dirty man of Europe. Our rivers and streams are we haven't got a single river that is in a high state of good quality, water quality. Not a single one.
It's a shocking statistic, and it struck me as well, and to hear it, yeah, half of it is to do with farming, the other half is to do with human waste. It's a shocking statistic. Yeah. There's thoughts on that. Would you have a view of where we would go with architecture and into?
Well, maybe the rivers, perhaps. I mean, living on a river myself, it's a special area of conservation, the river fowl. And the first thing they did when it was a European initiative, and they surveyed the whole catchment area of the fowl. Every farm was visited, every gateway was examined to sort of try and realign it and to look into to sort of keeping the spoil off it and out of the river. And as a result, a mussel farm which had been working quite happily was then, within a few years, had to be closed down. The pollution was still there, the problem was still there, the runoff was still there, the phosphates, all the problems you get with high agricultural runoff was still there. The Fowl is a tiny river. It's tidal, and it shows the problem. Agriculture is a big thing. We've got meters and meters of mud from agricultural runoff.
Yeah, from agricultural runoff.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that needs to be addressed agriculturally, industrially, and the water companies are not doing what they should be doing.
Yeah, there's incentives like everything, it needs to be incentivized, doesn't it? I think the question is, and it's putting value against it, which is where it's so interesting hearing about the sort of balancing in the books. I mean, it really is something, if you like, it's the sense of the industry that you're running there, a wilding farm, is providing revenue, Isabella. I mean, those are the directions that I think we see farm or land management, I should say, rather than farming, going.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got the carrot now, which is the payments for public goods, which I think is going to change dramatically the mindset of every farmer and land manager in the country. But also, I think we need the stick. We need to exert the polluter pays principle to anyone who is polluting watercourses or the soil or anything else.
I think it's the adage as ever thus, isn't it? It's with both, with the stick and the carrot. And I'm interested because when those sort of financial models balance up and suddenly it's more equitable to do these things, then the nudge is already there, the incentive is already there. And to pick up on your first point when we started this conversation, there is this seismic shift, I think, in curiosity and awareness about it. And it seems to me that your project, which was founded out of necessity, and the sort of, I suppose, probably deeply rooted, but perhaps unrealized or unexpressed sense of wanting to see the landscape differently, has led 20 years on to kind of a template for what is possible. And it draws me in my mind to the summation of a conversation with Oliver Steeds on Necton, which was to do with the underwater oceans, where he said the most successful projects so far have been these captured zones of regenerative fishing, where you just completely block off anything. And it's these key little areas around. And he said the return to whatever normality might be the benchmark has been extraordinary. And similar language to what you've described in terms of diversity, biodiversity. It's really systemic. I sort of wonder at this moment in time, being as we come towards the hour, whether we might just let the thoughts kind of dwell around us in our minds a bit. And certainly one that's going to me is this idea of changing aesthetics. I sort of love the idea of falling in love with a thorny bush. It's sort of not occurred to me before. And clearly we do. So I wondered if we might leave this evening with a thought from you both as to what we individually, or us personally here at Messland, if you wish, should be doing, if anything at all?
Shall I just kick off? I was listening to Ben Goldsmith last week. I mean, an extraordinarily sort of clear and lucid explanation of what's needed in regenerative agriculture and food production. But he left his closing thought was he said, look, none of this is important. What's really important and what really makes a difference is a re-enchantment. It's a re-engagement with the natural world. And I think that's, we were talking about pollution and water companies. I think, we as consumers, we as people who value the natural world and therefore react against its degradation, we are the sort of most powerful force. And I think that single thing of re-engaging, rediscovering our love and just going for a walk, and re-engaging and sort of sacralizing the natural world, and in all its complexity, and going with it. And I feel that's really why Isabella's project has struck such a chord, because it's not a controlling thing. It's a stepping back, and it's an act of love, rather than domination.
Yeah, it's a very elegiac way of describing it. It strikes me as a writer, you've a brilliant way to visually put that in, and to kind of make us see things differently. Thank you, Philip. And
I would say we have a duty really to learn what we're looking at, and so when we talk about engaging with nature, absolutely, and I think there's a huge hunger for that at the moment, and I think it will continue. I think COVID has shown us has the scales have fallen from our eyes a bit, but I think when we're wanting to be re-enchanted by nature, I think we have to know what it is we're looking at. And, like we were saying, it is changing that aesthetic. It's understanding what is depleted when we're looking at it, and freeing ourselves from that sort of nostalgic, sort of emotional sense of beauty that is very misplaced. And I think essentially we just need to get messy. I think if we could go back, instead of taking as our baseline for what nature should be, the Victorians, we always go back to a Victorian baseline, which is absolutely wrecked. We should go back to a medieval baseline. Let's get back to the romance of those amazing forests, the deer forests, the wild boar, when we still had beavers, when there were really exciting things out there. Let's be ambitious and conjure up the forests of the future in a different way.
Well, thank you for showing us the way, and also what's possible in what you've done at NEP. It's an extraordinary litmus test of what nature can do, left to its own devices. And I'm really heartened, and I'm sure all of us here probably feel the same thing. Hugely grateful to you both for committing to words and thoughts. What is your experience and insight into, I suppose, more broadly, a way of life, really, just a different way of seeing things? And as we all collectively pivot, I think, to a greater sense of awareness in our part within nature, the sense of things that can change left to their own devices, I think is a hugely nourishing thought, actually. It fills me with a great deal of relief, because otherwise I think we are justifiably be quite nervous citizens. So I should mention, you are, not that it just seems like a very good idea, not because for any other reason for mentioning, but there is a handbook which you're working on, which I know I'll be very keen to see later on when it comes out. It'd be a perfect way to kind of feel like you can get your hands onto this project. And I'm afraid, being like Philip, a doer, I know a lot of you here tonight are also doers, well, we wanted to go and do something in the landscape, and I hope now we'll do it more informed than we were an hour ago. So thank you both very much for giving of your thoughts, and thank you all very much for taking part in this evening's conversation and thoughts, and definitely one of the busiest chat columns we've had in a long time. I've been fielding a lot of questions. I hope I've answered them all for you. If I haven't, I really, really do apologize. I'll do my best. This talk and Ben's Goldsmith's talk, which they mentioned, Oliver Steeves' one, it will be on the back of the Message website. So if you want to pick it up or you want to share it, it's really important messaging that's attached to this, as well as being a fantastic insight. So thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.